So let's talk about costs in the short run. These are the main formulas which you will need to remember. So could you please put an exclamation mark somewhere next to this slide or make a note somewhere for yourself? These are the formulas which you'll need to know. Strictly speaking, your exam will be open book, so you will be able to come back to these formulas. But if you'll need to refer to these formulas in exam, it will take you time, so it's much better to memorize them. Moreover, they are not difficult at all. I will explain you all these formulas, and you will need to know them by heart. Even if you are an accountant or manager, you will need to know the meaning of these formulas. You will use them on everyday basis. So the earlier you learn them, the more comfortable you will be and the better analysis you will be able to do later in your course of study and in your professional life. So these are your basic tools, your basic concepts. You really need to know them super well. So let's start gradually, and hopefully you will find this material really easy. It's not difficult at all, you'll see. So we are going to study three types of costs first: total, average, and marginal costs. What are total costs of production? Total cost is simply a sum of all your expenditure which were incurred in the production process. This will include both fixed and variable costs. So formula for total costs will look like this. Total cost is a sum of total fixed and total variable costs. So let's have a look at this example. As you can see here, I've copied your presentation slide here, and I will be adding some additional notes. And by the way, you will be able to download this file from your Moodle. It's like a folder which is organized by different topics. You can see all these notes, and there are different subsections within each topic. And I'm creating the same folder for this particular lecture, and you will be able to download this from Moodle later. So this is what we are discussing now. Let's imagine that we run a takeaway shop, pizza shop, we make pizzas, and these are our expenditure during these months. For example, in September 2020, this is what we've spent. We've spent some money on materials in order to cook our pizzas. We buy certain raw ingredients, for example, flour or tomatoes or pepperonis or cheese, oil, etc. And in September, we've spent £1,000 on these materials. We've also spent £3,000 on labor. This is how much we've paid in staff wages, and we've also paid £2,000 in rent. So we try to calculate total costs of production. This is what we need to do. So how can we do this? We can add up all of the costs together. But before we do this, we can try to separate them into variable and fixed cost. So materials and labor is our total variable costs of production. So it will be £4,000. These are the variable costs. Why are they variable? Because they depend on the amount of output which we produce. In order to make more pizzas, we need more materials. They are related to our output level. This will be variable costs. If we want to produce more pizzas, we need to work for more hours. So we will need to pay for more staff, and our labor costs will be higher. That is why labor costs is also variable cost. It's a part of variable costs. So together, 1 and 3,000 is 4,000. These are our variable costs of production. While rent does not depend on the amount of pizzas which we produce. This is what we've paid on 1st of September to our landlord, and that's it. And he is not interested in our activity levels. So rent is our fixed cost of production. So if we add up together 4,000 of variable costs and 2,000 of fixed cost, our total costs will come at £6,000. This is the total cost of production. Now, the second type of cost which we'll need to learn is the average cost, which is very simple. It's simply a cost per unit. So how much does it cost us to produce a single pizza? Average cost can be calculated in two ways. So that is why you will have two formulas here. The first method, as average cost is simply a cost per unit. In order to calculate cost per unit, you take total cost and divide this by total number of units produced. So let me show you how to do it. Let's imagine that our output is, let's say, 1,000 pizzas, 1,000 units. This is what we've managed to produce. That is why average cost per unit is total cost, total amount which we've spent, divided by output. So it's 6,000 divided by 1,000 units, which is £6 per unit. This is the result of our first formula, this formula, cost per unit. So it's simply £6 per unit. Alternatively, if I come back to the previous file, we can try to calculate average cost per unit as a sum of average variable cost per unit and average fixed cost per unit. And in order to calculate these individual components, we take the total variable cost, divide by number of units, and total fixed cost, and divide by number of units. I'll show you using the same example, and you will see that it's super simple. So let me just switch to another color. Have a look. Here, average variable cost and average fixed cost. We've spent £4,000 in total in order to produce 1,000 pizzas. So this was our cost of materials and labor. Our total variable cost came at 4,000. 4,000 spent to produce 1,000 units, which implies that it will be £4 of variable cost per unit. Let me write it here again. Average variable cost is total variable costs divided by number of units. In total, we've spent 4,000 in order to produce 1,000 units. In other words, cost of labor and materials came at £4 per unit. Now, similarly, we can calculate average fixed cost per unit. Our total cost came at 2,000. Average fixed cost is total fixed cost divided by quantity. Our total fixed cost came at 2,000. And this amount allowed us to produce 1,000 units in this particular month. As a result, our fixed cost came at £2 per unit, right? So this is what we've done. So cost of materials and labor, £4 per unit. Cost of rent per unit of output is £2 per each pizza produced. If we add up these two numbers together, it implies that average cost per each unit will be equal to £6. And this is exactly what we've calculated previously. So sum of average variable plus average fixed cost, which is our cost per unit, is 4 plus 2 is £6. So this is an illustration of how we use this second part of the formula. It looks more difficult by looking at the formula than it actually is. When you plug in the numbers, everything is very simple and straightforward. So total cost is simply all costs of production, and average cost is simply a cost per unit. So this is more or less intuitive. The next type of cost is slightly more difficult to understand, marginal cost. Let's have a look at this final paragraph. Marginal cost is an extra cost of supplying an additional unit of output. It's an extra cost. It's not average, it's not total. It's totally different type of cost. It's an extra additional cost which is required in order to produce an additional unit of output. In other words, it shows how your total cost will increase if you increase output by one extra unit. And that is why in order to calculate marginal cost, you'll need to compare change in total cost with change in output. If output changes by 1 unit, how will your total cost increase? Remember, we've learned this symbol from the lecture on elasticity. This triangle stands for a change. So to calculate marginal cost, we look at how total costs change if we change output. Let me give you an example. Let's imagine that our original output level is 1,000 units and our total cost for this output level is equal to £6,000. This is what we've calculated, right? This is what we've got. Let's imagine that we want to increase our output by 1 extra unit. In other words, change in output level is equal to 1. We increase output by 1 extra unit. The question is, how will total cost change? What will be the new cost of production? Total costs new for output, which is 1,001 unit. How high will it be? The most common answer which I frequently get is £6,006, and this is incorrect. Because yes, your average cost per unit is £6, but it doesn't mean that when you produce an extra unit, your costs will increase by £6. Why is that? pause the video, think for a minute, and come back. Any ideas? Any thoughts on this? Why would our cost increase by a different amount, not by £6? This is because certain type of your expenditure does not vary with the amount of output. You will not need to pay an additional rent when you increase your output. You've paid your rent for the whole month already, which means that when you increase production, when you produce more pizzas beyond your original amount, you won't need to pay your rent. You will only need to pay for extra materials. You will need to buy more flour, more oil, more tomatoes, more pepperonis, more any other fillings you are using, and you will need to pay to the worker who will actually make this pizza. So your only additional costs will come from your variable costs. In other words, the total cost of production are going to be £6,004, not 6. In other words, your marginal costs or additional costs, they show how total costs change due to change in output. Your total costs will change by £4. You will need to pay 4 extra pounds in order to produce 1 extra unit. In other words, your marginal costs are going to be £4, not 6. Average cost is not equal to marginal cost. This is an additional different type of cost, and you need to be aware of this difference.